Streamers and Wings. I'm your host, Josh Shepherdson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post as at BChad50. And jumping right into things, I'm going to repeat a waiver wire ad suggestion from last week, and that's running back Amir Abdullah. Abdullah played just 20 snaps in the nightmarish finish for the Detroit Lions on Thursday Night Football last week, but he made the most of his time out on the field. Carried the ball 13 times for 67 yards, was easily the leading rusher for the team. Riddick in snaps played that game. Riddick played 34 snaps, but going forward, I would expect Joique Bell's usage to be curbed. Bell played 14 snaps that week, but the Lions lost. Now that they're essentially not competing for a playoff spot, you'd expect them to get a look at some of their young talent, maybe give Abdullah some more touches. And Theo Riddick's also a part of the future, so he's certainly going to have a role as a pass-catching back. But I would not expect to see Joique Bell continuing to see 14 snaps a game. They know what they have there. There's not much. Abdullah and Riddick are clearly the future of their backfield, or at least they hope they are. And now it's time to evaluate some of that young talent. And a great stretch of games for Abdullah to showcase his stuff down the stretch. This week he plays a Rams squad that coughed up 99 yards rushing to fellow rookie runner David Johnson, and also were carved up for 79 yards rushing by the combination of Kerwin Williams and Stephon Taylor. In all, that is over 170 yards rushing to a trio of backs that are not certainly amongst the game's elite. David Johnson looks like he could have a bright future, but we're not talking about an elite trio of running backs that carved up this St. Louis Rams team. Amir Abdullah's looked good running the football of late, and you'd expect with the Lions probably evaluating some of their young talent, maybe Abdullah gets upwards of 15 to 20 touches this week. Wasn't that far off from that touch total against the Packers last week with 13 carries. Was targeted once in the passing game, didn't reel in that target, but it gets even better after this week as well. In week 15, he faces a Saints squad that's allowed the third most fantasy points per game to running backs, according to Pro Football Reference. And in the final week of the fantasy season, anyway, week 16, for most leagues, he faces the 49ers, and they've allowed the most fantasy points per game to running backs this year. So with 3+ matchups here down the stretch, good time to grab Amir Abdullah. 71% owned in CBS leagues, 47% owned in ESPN leagues, and 58% owned in Yahoo leagues. So he is fairly widely available considering all the injuries sustained at running back and just the lack of depth at the position at this point. My next waiver wire ad suggestion is the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, and this edition isn't suggested to use them this week. In fact, I would keep them glued to the bench against a tough Cincinnati Bengals offense, but they're 53% owned in CBS leagues, 38.6% owned in ESPN leagues, and 38% owned in Yahoo leagues. And week 15 and 16 shape up to be very good matchups for the Steelers. If you're a gamer who has a bye in your first week of the playoffs, like I do in one league, or you simply have some bench spots that really aren't being well utilized right now, maybe there aren't handcuffed backs worth holding on to at this point, or you've had a player suffer an injury that's just not going to have any value at this point, grabbing the Steelers now has a chance to pay off big time the last 2 weeks of the season. Obviously, Antonio Brown looked great returning a punt for a touchdown the other night on Sunday Night Football. But there's more to it than that. They can get after the passer. They can force turnovers. But again, it's the matchups that I'm looking at. In week 15, the Steelers host the Broncos. Well, the Broncos hung 30 points on New England. They've scored points in the other two starts by Brock Osweiler. They're a very run-heavy offense, and that's not a good formula for success against the Steelers. The Steelers are allowing the sixth fewest rushing yards per game at 90.3 rushing yards per game, and they surrendered just 4 rushing touchdowns. If you're going to beat the Steelers, you're going to do it through the air most likely. And I'm not ready to anoint Osweiler ready as a quarterback to really tear up an opposing defense. So I like the matchup for them in that contest. But better yet, in Week 16, the Steelers' defense might be gifted a free 6 points. And while that probably seems like hyperbole, it's not necessarily. Matt Schaub has basically been a pick six machine. It's unbelievable, his run of throwing a pick six. I believe it's something like 5 of his last 7 contests. I don't understand how a quarterback can continue to do that, but I'm not going to ask the questions. I'm just going to take advantage of this plus matchup against a injury depleted Baltimore Ravens team. They are on the road, but that's a great matchup. Matt Schaub does a poor job of taking care of the football, and even if he doesn't throw a pick six, you'd expect for the Steelers to be able to keep Buck Allen in check on the ground and force Matt Schaub to air it out, and he just doesn't have weapons to pick them apart. And to be quite frank, he doesn't have the arm talent to pick them apart either at this point in his career. Moving on to the streaming options for this week. The first one should be fairly obvious at quarterback, and that's Jameis Winston. He's owned in 76% of CBS leagues, 35.8% of ESPN leagues, and 40% of Yahoo leagues. And he gets the Saints this week. And the Saints are easily the most giving fantasy defense to opposing quarterbacks. They're allowing the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks at 24.9 points allowed per game in standard scoring leagues. They've yielded 35 passing touchdowns, have forced just 6 interceptions. And to just kind of put that in perspective, no other team has allowed even 30 touchdown tosses this year. So they have been dreadful. They've allowed 287.3 passing yards per game and an unfathomable 116.6 QB rating. And keep in mind that that's net yards passing per game according to Pro Football Reference. If you look at the fantasy scoring page for quarterbacks, they've allowed over 300 yards passing per game gross for quarterbacks this year. So they're getting shredded. Winston is best at 200 yards passing in all but one game this year. He's averaging 239.8 yards passing per game and throwing 17 touchdown passes, which isn't exactly great, but it's certainly decent for a rookie quarterback with his legs, averaging 13.1 yards rushing per game, which is a little over a point per game in normal scoring leagues. And he's found the end zone 5 times on the ground. So in all, he has 22 touchdowns on the season, 5 on the ground, 17 through the air. Done a decent job of taking care of the football and gets a great matchup against the Saints this week. You're going to want to go ahead and basically plug in any quarterback against the Saints here down the stretch. Unless you have an elite signal caller, Winston looks like a good play. Looks like a top 10 scoring signal caller this week to me. Moving on to wide receiver, my streaming option here is going to be Marvin Jones, owned in 65% of CBS leagues, 47.6% of ESPN leagues, and 54% of Yahoo leagues. He becomes a much stronger play if Tyler Eifert is forced to miss another game. It's early in the week. Not sure what his playing status will be. We'll have to monitor that throughout the week. But even if Eifert plays, it's a plus matchup for Marvin Jones against the Steelers. Steelers have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. And reiterating what I noted in the Steelers defense tout in terms of adding them, not to use this week, obviously, but they've been stingy against the run, so that should force the Bengals to air it out just a little bit more. Marvin Jones carved out a pretty nifty role in this offense for them, not a high ceiling guy, averaging 49.6 yards receiving per game and 3.9 receptions per game, but he's quietly posted 55 yards or more from scrimmage in 3 straight games, and in all, he's posted 55 yards from scrimmage or more, or reached the end zone in 7 games this year. So he's definitely had some viability as a low-end flex play. If you're hurting and looking to plug in a player this week, either as a wide receiver 3 or a flex, Jones is a widely available guy with a really good matchup. And obviously, if Eifert misses the contest, then his ceiling actually is higher than one might expect looking at his game log for the year. Moving on to tight end, going right back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Well, and last week I suggested Cameron Brate as a stream option with thinking that he would be a good play again this week. I prematurely wrote off Austin Seferian-Jenkins at tight end, assumed he would be done for the year, even though he hadn't been ruled out yet. Looked like he hadn't been released to for contact and practices, and it seemed like most likely he was going to need a little bit more time to build some strength in the shoulder and may end up being shut down for the season, but that didn't turn out to be the case. Austin Seferian-Jenkins was active for the first time since week 2 this past week, and he was actually the second most targeted member of the Buccaneers with 6, turned those 6 targets into 3 receptions for 31 yards. Outproduced Cameron Brate, even though he played 21 snaps to Brate's 33. I'd expect that gap in snaps played to close with Austin Seferian-Jenkins getting in a full week of practice, probably full practices this week. I wouldn't expect any limitations after playing in the contest over the weekend. And the fact that Jameis Winston was willing to trust him after the lengthy layoff, they hadn't played together since week 2, it is favorable for his outlook for this week, and the best matchup available to tight ends facing the Saints. The Saints have allowed the most fantasy points per game to tight ends, and Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a big target that seems to have some rapport with Jameis Winston, even though they haven't really played together much in games that count. But like the matchup, like the trust shown by Winston last week, and I think it's a good opportunity for Jenkins to be a low-end tight end 1 this week. If you happen to roster a guy like Jimmy Graham or Rob Gronkowski, I guess in Graham's case at this point he's probably cut, but if you rostered him and you're still looking to fill that void at tight end and you're streaming here down the stretch, ASJ looks like a good play to me. Finally, I'm going to suggest using this week would have been unfathomable earlier in the season, but they've been playing really well since their bye week, and that's the Detroit Lions. Obviously, they're coming off of a heartbreaking loss in which Aaron Rodgers completed a Hail Mary for a touchdown. If that, some want to call it a phantom face mask, it was a close call. There was definitely hands to the face, but there was definitely no grabbing or turning of the face mask. Not surprisingly, NFL officials are backing their own and saying that it was a good call, but I mean, the state of officiating this year has been quite bad, contrary to what Roger Goodell will try to force feed NFL fans, saying that it's been extraordinary. That's a joke. It's obviously been quite poor, and a number of media types are even calling out the poor officiating at this point this year because it has been that dreadful. But if the game had stopped with the Aaron Rodgers tackle and no face mask call, we'd be talking about the Lions playing at a really high level. They would have only allowed 21 points to the Packers at that point. Obviously, that's not how the game ended, but they did hold the Packers to just 313 yards of offense and forced 1 turnover while recording 3 sacks. So I would say the Lions defense has played at a pretty high level, even with that Hail Mary loss. Did a good job of keeping the running game in check, and actually held Aaron Rodgers pretty well in check. Since their Week 9 bye, they held 3 opponents to under 20 points and 2 opponents to under 300 total yards of offense. So they are playing at a really high level defensively, and they have a great matchup this week. They're actually 1-point underdogs, surprisingly, on the road against the Rams. I'm not one to often question the odds makers, but this one looks a little bit funny to me. The game does feature the lowest over-under total of the week at 40.5 points. And yep, that is lower than the 41 featured in the 49ers-Browns contest, just to kind of offer some perspective there. I mean, there is not a lot of scoring expected in this Lions contest with the Rams, and that's understandable because the Rams are averaging the second fewest points per game at 15.8, and they've turned the ball over 20 times. So I think not only do the Lions have a high floor, since the Rams don't score a lot, and if they do have success, it's most likely to be on the ground, obviously capping their scoring opportunities to some extent if they're going to be milking the clock and running the ball. But I also think the Lions have a high ceiling. If they can continue to defend the run well, as they have of late, keep Gurley in check, the Rams do not have the passing attack to take advantage of loaded up boxes to stop Todd Gurley. So I think this is a low-scoring affair. I like the Lions defense in this one. And as I said, I think they have both a high floor and a high ceiling in this contest. And with just 20% CBS ownership, 10.3% ESPN ownership, and 11% Yahoo ownership, they are widely available and a very strong play if you don't have an elite defense. Obviously, if you've got a defense like the Panthers, who are big favorites this week, the Broncos, some of these other elite defenses, probably best to ride them out because they do have slightly higher ceilings. But if you've been rostering a middle-of-the-pack defense or you've been streaming defenses all year, the Lions certainly stand out as a really strong play this week. And that's going to wrap things up for this week's Streamers and Waiver Wire podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for articles, podcasts and an active forum to help you win your fantasy matchups and hopefully win yourself a fantasy football championship this year. Till next week, good luck.